What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. It's Saturday, May 10th. Sorry, this is a day late. I was sitting down to record this last night, but Grammy wanted me to come watch Dateline with her, so that's what I did. But let's recap day 13 in the Karen Reed retrial. And on the stand again, Yuri Bukhenik. He was the only witness on the stand yesterday. They left off discussing one of the trips to 34 Fairview when he met with Chief Berkowitz. Did you ever learn if Chief Berkowitz ever communicated one way or the other with Brian Higgins? No. February 10th, you went to 34 Fairview to conduct another search. On that occasion, you recovered 6 pieces of red, clear, or black plastic. The witness says yes, but he doesn't know the exact number. So he's handed a report which refreshes his memory, and the defense says you would consider that incredibly important to the investigation? Yes. Can you describe for the jury where each of the 6 pieces of plastic fragments were found? The witness said in the general vicinity of where it was originally excavated, where John was found, and where other items of evidence have been located. He did not document the exact locations for these pieces of plastic. Defense says it's a broad area for small pieces of physical evidence to be found. And you're working on an assumption there was some sort of an impact at 34 Fairview involving an SUV with a human being. The witness said the evidence was pointing to that. They had a damaged taillight and they found pieces of that on the lawn at 34 Fairview. He said he wasn't assuming anything, but rather the evidence was speaking to them. You were utilizing assumptions and presumptions on information people provided to you. The witness talks about how they gather evidence and they put it together into the case. They verify statements along with the evidence. Defense, you make assumptions with those suggestions. The witness said they had theories. And based on the statement, I hit him, I assumed there was an impact of some sort. Utilizing that with the evidence we had, which was a broken cocktail glass that came in contact with the victim, his injuries presented a certain way, and we learned more information. And that's how investigations develop. We were working on a report of an injured male party and developed the investigation from there. The defense asks, do you know what the word theory means? And the witness says, English is a third language for him, and if the defense wants to hand him a Webster's dictionary, he can read it out. The defense says, you want me to pull up a Webster's dictionary? You want to take a break and look up a word you used in an answer 40 seconds ago when you said, we are working off of a theory? You said it, not me. There was an objection that was sustained. February 10th, you went to the scene and found 6 pieces of plastic and 14 pieces of glass. You didn't photograph it? No. Did you do cross coordinates? The witness said he has never learned how to do that. The defense goes on to explain how you would do cross coordinates. And then he asked the witness, do you know how to do cross coordinates? And the witness said, you just demonstrated it to me. The defense points out the witness had a cell phone, which has a camera, and you didn't think it was needed to call crime scene out to photograph these items. The witness said he could have done both. Can you show her a report where you say you recovered these items? The witness says, yeah, you showed me a report that says they were all recovered at 34 Fairview. The defense asks, is there a report that says exactly where these 20 items were found? And the witness zones out. He's just checked out for a hot minute. And the defense says, that was a question. I'm waiting. The witness says, I didn't realize. So the defense repeats the question. The witness said the report is what you just presented, saying that the items were found in the same general vicinity. If something was found across the street, that would have been documented. They go back and forth about this for a while. In fact, this issue right here took up at least an hour and a half of testimony first thing yesterday. They hand a photo of the evidence bag that documents with the case number, who recovered it, and the general description of the plastic that was recovered, and they put that up on the screen. The defense points to the section where it says location, where it was collected. The witness reads 34 Fairview Road, Canton, Mass. The defense points out there's several lines here, and that's it. You didn't fill this back out? And then he asks, who filled this out? The witness does not know. The defense says, you don't recognize the handwriting of your subordinate, Michael Proctor? Were you with Proctor when it was bagged? The witness said, no, he was by himself. Did you give this to Michael Proctor to bag? No, he did it himself. Then whose handwriting is this? The witness doesn't know. If you bagged it yourself, why didn't you fill out the evidence envelope? The witness said, I bagged it and turned it over and told him exactly where it was and what time. Someone else wrote the information. Defense, you just said I bagged it and told him. The witness says, turned it over to them. Defense, no, sir. You said I bagged it and turned it over to him. Who is him? Witness again says them. Defense, who's them? And the witness says, whoever wrote it. The defense says, we are just in a circle here. The judge tells Mr. Jackson, no comments, just questions. So he asks, was this evidence important? The witness, every piece of evidence is important. You had the evidence and turned it over to someone you don't know and you can't identify. The witness said it was a member of the Massachusetts State Police assigned to our office, not a random person. I can't identify who wrote on that bag, but it was a trusted member of our team. The defense says, but how can you say a trusted member if you don't know who it is? Who were among those you would have turned it over to? The witness says DeChico, Trooper Kakowski, Trooper Dunn, and Trooper Michael Proctor. The defense repeats those names and asks if he remembers turning it over to each one. Did you turn it over to DeChico? And so on. The witness says no to each one. Defense, so it could be a stranger. And the witness says, that's a ridiculous suggestion. You've seen Proctor's handwriting maybe hundreds of times, and the witness says maybe dozens. So he's handed some papers and asks, whose handwritten notes are those? The witness says, you labeled it Proctor, but he doesn't know whose handwriting it is, but based on the ones that were interviewed, it might suggest these are Trooper Proctor's notes. Defense, is it standard procedure that whoever recovers the items, they fill out the evidence bag contemporaneous to the recovery of the item? The witness said if there's a reason you have to leave, like an emergency or weather conditions, you can do it later. And in this case, it was found in a general vicinity. He says he passed it on. Defense, so it went from you to someone who wasn't there filling it out? The witness said, yes, I was by myself. I told them the information. How do you know that you told them all about that? The witness said, because it was put on the bag. You can't remember who you talked to. You don't remember what was said. It goes hand in hand. The witness said it's not true. When it was bagged, I remembered that day, and that's why the information is accurate on there. The defense says information you didn't fill out, items that were given to someone you can't remember. The witness says today, I cannot remember. Defense, that evidence bag was not opened until March 14th, 2022. The witness said that the items were collected February 10th. Do you know the difference between collecting and booking it into evidence? Was it booked into evidence on February 10th? The witness asks for a document, so he's given one. It takes a minute. And the defense asks if that is a log sheet for the crime lab. The witness says one document he's looking at is a chain of custody for the crime lab of all the evidence that was processed, received, and returned. The other is a receipt of evidence being submitted on a certain day to the lab. Defense points out the first time the evidence was submitted to the crime lab was March 14th, 2022, and there's no indication on any document where these items were before March 14th. The witness says there is. It was at the Norfolk DA's office. Whose possession? The witness says mine, and then I turned it over. The defense says you turned it over to someone we don't know. The next time any documentation is done is March 14th, which is nearly 5 weeks later. The witness says he does not know that to be correct. You can't point to any chain of custody documents between February 10th and March 14th. They go back through everything that was just said. At some point, there is an objection that's sustained. The defense says all physical evidence booked into the crime lab was done so by Trooper Proctor. The witness doesn't know, but if you got a document, I can look. So he's handed a document. And the witness says, Michael Proctor. You're aware Proctor has submitted 46 or so pieces of taillight material since January 29th. The witness does not know the total number. According to you, Proctor recovered some of those pieces of taillight? Yes. And some as late as February 18th? Yes. He doesn't know if it was Proctor or someone else who recovered it on February 18th. The defense says on February 10th, when you made your final visit to 34 Fairview, there was very little snow. He hands him a document, and it shows that on February 11th and March 9th, there were large pieces of red and black taillight that were found. The defense then shows an evidence bag dated February 11th at 9 a.m., and it shows 3 pieces of clear plastic and 5 pieces of red plastic. The defense points out this is the day after you were there. They talk about the measurements of these taillight pieces. One was about the size of a dollar bill, and the defense points out you didn't see that, did you? Because it wasn't there, was it? The witness said he would have picked it up if he saw it. The defense points out it was found by Trooper Proctor. They bring in another evidence bag from February 18th, and it's a collection of red plastic that was collected by Trooper Proctor. They show the measurements of another piece of plastic. It's more than 6 inches, and the witness estimates maybe 7. Again, February 10th, you were there with very little snow on the ground. The witness said there was still snow on the ground where it had been excavated. Defense, but you didn't see these? Witness said if I did, it would have been collected. They allowed the natural thawing of the snow to reveal additional items. But you didn't see any of the items when you were there that were collected by Trooper Proctor? No. They move on to the video from the Waterfall. He asks who was there when John and Karen arrived. Brian Higgins was there. And on January 28th and 29th, Higgins had a romantic interest in Miss Reed. Did you get certain text messages from Brian Higgins during your interview? The witness said that Brian Higgins gave him an extraction of his cell phone. It was not performed at the request of the witness. So the defense says Brian Higgins provided you something he said was from his phone. Yes. They were text messages between him and Karen, as well as texts between him and John. Defense, you never did an extraction, and he was never asked to give his phone over. The witness said, nope, he handed me these items. They talk about 2 strings of messages between Brian Higgins and John, and Brian and Karen. Would you say the texts to Karen were flirtatious in nature? The witness said he hasn't reviewed them recently, so he doesn't want to label them without understanding the content. The defense says, were they business text messages? The witness said they were friendly communications, but again, he does not want to put a label on it. Do you remember a text about a kiss that was exchanged? There is an objection that's sustained. And so they bring in these text messages between Brian Higgins and Karen Reed. Before we get into these, first off, I'm not reading every single text, but I'm going to hit the important parts here. And also, Sue O'Connell from NBC Boston is in the courtroom and was tweeting out some insight into the jury's reaction to these texts. So every now and then I may throw in something she observed. At first, they just have the witness read from the paper. It is very hard to follow. The texts were printed out, and I mean, it was thick. The judge asked Mr. Jackson, you're not going to ask him to read the whole document? And Jackson said, I expect to. So we go to a sidebar. Sue said some of the jurors were giggling when this happened, but the judge tells the jury they're going to put these on the screen so they can follow along. And the witness asked the judge if he should start from the beginning. The judge kind of laughs and says no, and then pretty much everybody in the courtroom laughed too. These start January 12th of 2022, so not long before John O'Keefe died. Karen got his number from someone they both knew. At first, they're talking about Smirnoff ice screwdrivers. Brian tells Karen he's going to save her in his phone as either Karen Screwdriver or Weed Whacker. Karen preferred Weed Whacker as the nickname. They talk about Carrie for a second. Karen said they all frequent the same watering hole, but she doesn't really know her well. Karen tells Brian she went out for drinks alone the night before. And she says, sadly, I know everyone in there at this point because of how much I go. Brian says to Karen he didn't know she was so sensitive. And Karen says, when was I sensitive? To the weed whacking incident? And Karen said, I just snap when I think guys are being creeps. Can't help it. Brian, I'm not a creep. Karen sends a graphic of a guy holding a weed whacker, and she says, no, you're not a creep. She asked if he got an invite for Saturday. I went back and looked at the calendar. It seems to me this would have been January 15th if they meant that same week in their text exchange. Brian tells Karen he doesn't want to intrude on their couples night, and Karen says they like hanging out with non-couples. Karen tells Brian that he's hot, and he asks her if she is messing with him. She says she's serious, and he tells her the feeling is mutual. She asks if he is okay driving or if he wants to stay here. Brian said he's fine. He has an office at the police department. Karen says she would rather him stay there. They keep talking about how they've both been attracted to each other, and Brian says since the first time he saw her and that she's his type. And she says he's hot. It seems to me Brian stopped by John's house, and Brian said he's glad he stopped by and he should have come earlier. Karen said she was basically begging him. Brian says, you don't have to beg me. I'll give you whatever you want. They text some more, and he asks if everyone is asleep, and Karen says yes. Brian says he should have stayed then, and then he asks, now what? Karen says, what do you want? Hey, we're single. We don't have kids. We can do whatever we want. But Brian points out, don't you have a boyfriend? Karen asks where he is, and he is at the Canton Police Department at his office. Karen tells Brian she has a house from there, and she had that before she reconnected with John. Brian says, I don't think you're really saying what's on your mind. Karen asks, do you like me? And Brian says, yes, clearly. Karen tells him to come over to her house, and Brian asks when. Karen said, well, when works for you? They keep talking about him coming over that night to John's, and he asks if she's glad she walked him out. Karen says, yes, are you? Brian says, definitely. We kissed, right? He said he's following her lead on this, and Karen asks, why my lead? They go back and forth about her reaching out to him first, and she won't tell him why she reached out to him in the first place. They go back and forth for a minute. Karen asks if he's mad at her. He says, no, I'm not. He just never saw this coming because he thought she was happy with her situation. Karen told him that she was, but things have gone downhill. Her and John dated when they were kids, and then his sister died, and everything got effed up. Brian says John seems into her, and a little later asks if they're splitting up. Karen doesn't know. She says John hooked up with another girl on vacation, and then she points out she's very close to John's niece and says it's a very effed up situation. Karen said they went away for New Year's, just the four of them. She put the kids to bed and found him in the lobby of their hotel all over one of our friends. Whatever, it doesn't matter. They kind of switch topics sometimes, and these texts overlap with responses to something that was asked 3 sentences ago. At one point, Brian tells Karen she's getting defensive and asks if she felt guilty texting him, and she says no. He asks, what do you want from me? And she says nothing. Do you want anything from me? None of us is married. Brian says true, so game on. Karen says okay, game on then. And Karen asks Brian if they kissed earlier. Brian says, I think you initiated that. They move on to talk about partying, and Karen said she would have a party every weekend if it were up to her. The better parties are at her house because there's no kids there. They send each other photos of drinks they're having, and they talk about her house in Mansfield. Karen talks about being at John's house most of the time, but sometimes it's a lot because I went from being solo, trying to give attention to kids who aren't mine, and I never wanted kids. It's just a very complicated dynamic with the four of us. He isn't cut out for what he's doing, and the kids present constant issues. Brian says, I think John believes he's doing the right thing. Karen says, well, of course he is, but his heart isn't in it. It's only because he was very, very close to his sister. I try very hard, but they're very spoiled, and they're not my family. My parents keep telling me I would feel differently if they were mine or my own sisters. Then I told you he got drunk and sloppy on New Year's Eve while we were away, and that's really affected me. Brian asked, what exactly did he do? Karen said, I never got married, and now somehow I'm arguing with someone about raising kids. John was a puddle all day and then disappeared. I found him all over, a friend's sister in the lobby of our hotel, and she's gross, which I think may actually be worse, not sure. Brian asked, did they bang? Karen says, so I was with the kids celebrating New Year's without him, which shouldn't be my role. In regards to did they hook up, Karen says, no, I doubt it. He was a mess. Brian asks if she thinks this was John's first time or were there other times. Karen doesn't think there was anything before because she's with him all the time, and the issues with the kids bother her more than him actually cheating. They're constant, and it just feels like a lose-lose. Sue from NBC Boston tweeted out that several jurors wrote in their notebooks as this particular exchange was read about John's allegedly hooking up with somebody on vacation. A bit later, Karen asked Brian if he wants to go grab a drink, and he said if she would have given him some notice, he could have, but he has his work truck and not his personal truck. Karen says that sounds like an excuse. She later asks if going to a friend's house qualifies as transportation to drink. Brian says, yeah, I can't have just one, and he can't drive banged up. Karen says, well, have none then. There's 5 bedrooms here. Brian says, trust me, I'm tempted. He then asked Karen if she felt guilty for inviting him over. And Karen asked, should I? A few texts later, Brian says, you're clearly getting aggravated with me and my lack of participation. Karen says she's not. Brian says, I don't know. He asked if she's going to leave John, and she says she doesn't have plans at the moment, but sometimes she does go back and forth. Brian talks about he himself being a private person, and he doesn't talk out of school with what I do or who I hang with. Karen says, according to John, you may occasionally talk out of school. Brian responds, he said that about me? With respect to what exactly? Karen said, it's none of my business. But Brian says, now I'm aggravated. Karen says, oh my God, why? Brian says, like, why would he talk shut about me? And Karen says, because we all like you. Everyone does. Brian said, you said he just talked crap about me. Karen said, no, he wasn't. He always talks about how much he likes you. He just mentioned Brian does all right for himself, and he has not said one negative thing about you ever. She goes on to say that John and I have had a lot of ups and downs, and we already did this nearly 20 years ago. But now there's kids involved that gets attached and things get muddy. I don't know what the answer is, but I feel very strongly I've put my best effort in with all 3 of them and the extended family too. And at some point it gets frustrating and my actual feelings take precedence. Brian asks if she thinks it would complicate and confuse her situation if they hung out. And Karen says, probably, but do you only do things that simplify your life? Brian says, I complicate my life on the regular. He goes on to tell her he thought she was hot off the rip and she has an amazing personality. Later on, Karen says, John has showed me about 5 times the ring video of me walking you out on Saturday. And my voice and my accent are killing me softly. And Brian's like, what? Karen says, yeah, he has cameras everywhere. You cops. Brian says, Jesus. Karen said, John's like, Christ, are you guys hooking up? Brian says, oh my God, great. I don't need drama, dude. Karen says, no, it's fine. Brian says, you legit planted one on me. And Karen says, I know where the cameras are anyway. Duh. Brian, so your slick move isn't on there? And she says, of course not. Brian says, oh my God, I almost, and he put a vomit emoji. Karen said it was a peck anyway. I kissed Carrie and Gay Jeff too. Later on, she says she's already invited him over and she's not going to ask again. They talk about how she doesn't like sharing a bed with anybody and she has her own bed in Canton. Brian says, "You don't like to be spooned?" And she says, "Not for more than a minute or two." Later on in the text messages, Karen says, "I asked you over on a seemingly uneventful Tuesday." Brian says, "Yeah, with zero heads up, and I have to get up at 4:30." Karen says, "You said you were adaptable and tons of fun. I took that as an invite for an invite. I'm 42. I know what happens when you invite someone over for a drink." Brian, "So you think I'd just give it up to you?" After a few texts, Karen says, "I'm pretty sure we would have hooked up." He asks if she's just mad about John and the other girl. And Karen said, "There's a difference between being married to someone and dating them." She said, "They have no intention ever of getting married, and I don't care too much about the other girl." Brian asked if John is cool with her dating other people. And she says, "I'm not happy per se. I'm just realistic that there are cracks and is far from perfect." She also doubts John would be okay with her dating other people. She said, "If he's seeing someone else, I wouldn't want to know either way, and he probably feels the same." Later on, Karen is out with a friend, and Brian asks if she wants to stop by his house for a drink. She asks if he's going to give her the address, and they go back and forth about whether they should meet out or go to his house. She says, "Give me an address. I hate texting while driving." He tells her the street name and then to text when she's close so he can tell her where to park. Later on, there's a text where he tells her to park across from a red minivan and let me know when you're here. There was a text January 19th at 11:13 p.m. and she says, "Home, alive." Brian said, "Cool. Thoughts?" Karen says, "Mabes. You? You asked my thoughts." Brian says, "You didn't answer." Karen says, "I don't know my thoughts." Brian says, "Okay, I think I get it." And Karen says, "You have any questions? Do you have any?" And there's 2 question marks. There is no date here, but it seems like maybe a day or 2 has passed since they texted, since they got together for a drink. Brian texts Karen, "stranger." And at some point, he says something about being ghosted or a ghost. On January 23rd at 9:40 p.m., Karen said the phone works both ways, and they kind of go back and forth about this. January 28th, after Karen and John walk into the waterfall, Brian texts Karen, "Well?" with a question mark. Karen did not respond. January 29th, the day John dies. 11:54 a.m., Karen texts Brian, "John died." Sue tweeted out there were shocked looks on the jurors' faces when this was read. Some of the comments throughout the reading of these texts by Sue, the jurors were riveted. One younger juror was staring at the screen with his mouth wide open at one point, and some jurors were leaning forward with their elbows on their knees, very engaged. Back to questioning the witness. They go back and forth about whether or not this is what he would consider to be flirtatious. He said he wouldn't categorize it to that extent. There are some things Brian said, like "you're hot." There's talk about banging and hooking up. But his opinion is that Karen is an angry girlfriend. He does acknowledge that Brian makes some advances, but overall, his opinion is that Karen is trying to get emotional revenge for what happened on New Year's Eve. The witness says Brian repeatedly asked Karen, "What's your goal? What's your plan? What's your intent?" The witness was also given a text message by Brian Higgins between him and John. The last text the two men exchanged was January 29th at 12:20 a.m. Brian texted John, "You coming here?" And there were 3 question marks. The defense points out that Karen ignored the text that she got from Brian Higgins after walking into the bar with John. Then the defense asks if during the course of his investigation, did he see any calls between Brian Higgins and Brian Albert at 2:22 a.m. on the 29th. He can't say off the top of his head. The witness said, as he sits here, he never knew of this phone call until now. The defense points out they did not secure Brian Albert's phone to see what calls he made from the 28th into the 29th. The defense asked the witness if he's aware Brian Higgins destroyed his phone. There is a sidebar. The judge tells the jury to disregard that statement. He's asked if he's aware of a call at 1:35 a.m. by Brian Higgins, who was at the Canton Police Department. No. You didn't investigate that call? No, we never sought to get his phone. He said he wasn't somebody they felt they needed to get information from at that point. But the defense says even after you read the text messages between him and Karen, the witness said that Brian gave a forensic extraction of the text messages between him and Karen, as well as him and John. They also had John and Karen's phones and were able to verify and confirm the text messages were accurate. The witness said he made clear to Brian Higgins the extraction that was given needed to be accurate since they were investigating a homicide. The defense asked if that raised any suspicion in his mind about Brian Higgins having any motive when it came to John. The witness said the evidence spoke for itself. He was not suspicious of Brian Higgins' motives. Defense says there was a text at 12:20 a.m. from Brian to John. John's body was found just feet from the front door of 34 Fairview. But you originally said it may be an accident involving a cocktail glass to the face. And the witness says initially, yes. When you saw John at the hospital, you saw a big contusion, a big egg above his eye. The witness says that is not correct. His eyes were swollen, but there was no contusion above his right eye. Did you talk to any paramedics, and did they describe an egg above his right eye? The witness said he would need to see a report. He doesn't give him one, but the witness said his right eyelid and nostril had tiny, tiny lacerations. Defense, no broken bones and fractures other than his skull. And the witness said he's not a medical professional. So you didn't ask the doctor when you went to see him. The witness says he doesn't believe they reported he had any broken bones. Defense, another factor in the early morning hours is there was no taillight pieces found in that location. Did you consider that? The witness says that once they learned there was damage to Karen's car, they went from there. The defense says, but a leaf blower was used in the same area and there was no taillight material found at all. Did you know that? Yes. In fact, no taillight pieces were found until after that SUV was in Massachusetts State Police custody in that Sallyport. The witness says, I believe the first piece was found after it was in our custody. When you talked to Higgins, did you ask about possibly seeing John's body after he left 34 Fairview? And you knew around 1:30 there was only a dusting of snow on the ground. The witness doesn't know how much snow was on the ground. But Higgins told you he didn't see a body because of a snowbank. The witness has no memory of that statement. So the defense hands him a document. The witness said the reason Higgins wasn't paying attention to the grass is because Higgins was worried about the snowplow on the front of his vehicle, and he wasn't paying attention to anything but the snowbank. Defense, do you know at the time there was only a dusting of snow and there is no snowbank? The defense says Higgins mentioned plowing the driveway for the Alberts. I can't speak to how much snow was being plowed. They move on to video from the Waterfall. They bring it in. He has him point out Brian Higgins and Brian Albert. They play a part of the video where it shows the two men kind of squaring off in a stance. The defense asks if that's a fighting stance. The witness says you could say that, but it looks like a couple of buddies messing around. They weren't fighting. He's then asked to identify where Karen is in the video. He points her out. She's talking to John and two other men. He's asked if he knew Brian Albert is former military and Boston police. Yes. Brian Higgins, former military and combat veteran. The witness says he knows that now, but he already knew Higgins was a federal law enforcement agent. They show some of the video with Brian Albert with his hands around Brian Higgins. So he's grabbing Brian Higgins from behind with his arms around his belly. The witness said it looks like he's given the Heimlich maneuver, and then essentially says it looks like they're play fighting. They play some more. This is when John O'Keefe walks in the bar and greets everybody. But did you see him interact with both Brians after that? No. They move on to when there's the video of everybody leaving. You see Brian Higgins in the middle. To the left is Brian Albert, and to the right is Chris Albert. You see Brian Albert kind of push away Chris Albert's hand And then Higgins gestures to someone. So the defense shows on the video where John O'Keefe is. And you see that Brian is possibly waving John over towards the door. Next up, they bring in the video from John's camera by the garage. This is when you see Karen backing out when she is initially leaving to go look for John, and she backs into the SUV. They have a zoomed in portion of the left rear tire, and they show it moves as her SUV looks to make contact with the car. The witness says there may have been movement there, but the defense says last year you said you saw her car come near John's car. Having seen this now, do you still believe it came near, or do you think now it struck John's car? The witness says not with great certainty, but there does appear to be movement. Defense, you had this video early on in your investigation. During that time, was it your assessment the SUV did not make contact? The witness said the totality of it all was there was no damage that occurred to either vehicle. Defense says, not my question. Did it make contact? And the witness agrees there was movement. He asked the witness which area of the SUV collides with John's car, and the witness says the right rear area of the Lexus. That video was taken at 5:07 a.m. They move on to talking about Chloe, the Alberts' former family dog. Did you become aware the Alberts got rid of their dog? There is a sidebar. They come back. The witness said he learned they no longer cared for the dog. I don't know if get rid of the dog is accurate. They rehomed or adopted it. And he did look into that. He went to the dog's new home and assisted with identifying the dog and investigating the animal. Defense, what documentation did you use to identify Chloe? The witness said veterinarian records. The new owners didn't get the dog from the Alberts? No. The defense says someone with the last name Riley is the one who gave the new owners the dog, and she did not have any records of the dog. That's correct. In your report, you omitted the name of the new owner. The witness doesn't know. Did you omit the new location? He would need to see the report. He looks at it and says the new location of the dog is not in the report. The defense points out it doesn't say the dog's new name or the names of the new owners in the report. Also, there is no transfer record, no rehoming records, no purchase records. And the defense says all you have are documents that don't have the dog's new name or the new owner's name. And the witness agrees. The defense asks about how writing reports in a timely manner is very important. The witness says sometimes things go very rapidly, so you might take notes and later on write the report. So the defense goes through the time gap between incidents and when reports were written. There are more than 20 official reports in this case that were not done for more than 100 days after the event. 11 reports were written more than 300 days from the time of the event. 3 reports were written more than 400 days from the time of the event. And there were 4 that were more than 500 days from the event. And the longest delay of any report from the date of the event to the report being written is 581 days. The witness is not aware of any of that. They mentioned the 2 who were outside of 34 Fairview in the truck waiting for Julie. They were the ones that were behind Karen's SUV. You told Proctor to interview them in August of 2022. The witness doesn't remember, so the defense hands him a copy of text messages between him and Proctor. Did you have a communication with Proctor about talking to them? He doesn't remember after looking at the texts. The witness says, of course, it's important to interview eyewitnesses as quickly as possible, but sometimes things are detailed by other witnesses, and they had already interviewed the driver. They asked the driver if they were to talk to the other 2 occupants, would they have seen anything different? Ricky was interviewed on September 2nd, 2023. Do you believe that's a timely interview for an eyewitness? The witness said ideally it would have been quicker. That was the end of the day. Monday's start time is 1 hour later at 10 Eastern. I'll be live streaming, so come hang out with the Alibiers and I will recap day 14 for you Monday night. Hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend. We will see you soon.